So today we're tackling a really monumental question. As the entire world is teetering on the edge of a much wider conflict, we have to ask ourselves, are we just watching a war? Or is this something bigger? Is this the beginning of a collapse? The end of the global system that our entire modern world is built on?
Right, and the most immediate reason all the alarm bells are ringing is the very real threat of a global economic catastrophe. We're not just talking about concerned economists here. They're forecasting a tidal wave that could seriously impact every single one of us.
So let's set the scene. It's the morning of Tuesday, April 7th, 2026. This is day 39 since this whole thing started, and a series of pretty serious ultimatums are all about to expire. You can just feel the tension. Diplomatic channels are stretched to the absolute breaking point, and the whole world is basically just holding its breath.
Okay, the absolute flashpoint right now is the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has, for all intents and purposes, shut it down for any shipping aligned with the US. And look, this isn't some minor disruption. We're talking about a fifth of the entire world's oil supply getting choked off. The economic fallout from this is getting worse by the hour.
And if things weren't tense enough, the tension absolutely skyrocketed over the weekend because of this dramatic and very murky US Special Ops mission inside Iran. Now, depending on who you talk to, it was either a huge success or a complete and utter catastrophe.
So the official story from the US is that this was a heroic rescue mission. But Iran, and they're being backed by a growing number of independent analysts, is painting a very, very different picture. They're saying it was a high-stakes raid on a nuclear facility that got ambushed and went disastrously wrong.
And the reason so many people are skeptical of the official story, well, it really just comes down to the numbers. These are the reported US losses. The sheer amount of hardware, of aircraft that was destroyed, just doesn't line up with a simple rescue. It suggests something much bigger, and much more violent actually, took place.
Yeah, and outside of the Pentagon, the consensus seems pretty clear. The word you keep hearing over and over again is catastrophe, a massive military miscalculation that has really weakened the US position at the worst possible moment.
So this military fiasco at Isfahan has now become the backdrop for an incredibly tense diplomatic standoff. Really, it's defined by US ultimatums on one side and very firm Iranian rejections on the other.
The threats coming from the US have been, well, they've been characterized by these shifting deadlines. What started as a 48-hour ultimatum back on April 4th has been pushed back more than once. The current deadline is set for tonight, Tuesday, at 8 p.m. Eastern.
And the rhetoric is, well, it's pretty unconventional. This is a direct quote from a social media post by President Trump. It really showcases the kind of inflammatory language being used, and a lot of observers are pointing out that this kind of thing makes finding a diplomatic off-ramp extremely difficult.
In response to all this, Iran has laid out its own comprehensive set of counterdemands. And believe me, they are not interested in a temporary pause. They want a permanent end to the war, they want reparations, and they want full recognition of their control over the strait. From their point of view, anything less than that is just kicking the can down the road.
And this brings us right back to the global economy. Because this isn't just some regional spat anymore. The deadlock in the Gulf is radiating outwards, and it has the potential to trigger a severe worldwide recession.
So analysts are projecting that oil prices, which are already over $115 a barrel, could soar past $160 if this conflict escalates. And that's a price point that just cripples entire economies.
The historical parallel everyone's drawing is the 1973 oil crisis. But the really chilling forecast is that this time could be far, far worse. It could trigger a period of severe stagflation, that's high inflation plus a stagnant economy, on a scale we haven't seen in over 50 years.
And listen, this goes so far beyond the price of the pump. Energy is a foundational cost for literally everything. A spike this dramatic drives up the price of food, shipping, manufacturing. It threatens to grind the whole global economy to a halt.
Which leads us to the biggest and most profound question of all. What if this crisis represents something much more than a war or a recession? What if it signals the collapse of the entire global order that makes our modern world even possible?
Some analysts are actually calling this America's Suez moment. Now, what does that mean? Well, back in 1956, the Suez Crisis made it painfully clear that Britain was no longer the world's dominant power. Its time as a global hegemon was just over. The argument is that this conflict could be doing the exact same thing for the United States, exposing the real limits of its power and influence.
To really understand what's at stake, just think for a second about how a single microchip is made.
It's the perfect illustration of our globalized system. You've got raw materials from one continent, refined parts from another, machinery from a third, all assembled in a fourth. The modern world is literally one giant interconnected factory.
So what's the glue that holds this whole global factory together? For more than 70 years, it's been the U.S. Navy, keeping the world's sea lanes open for business. That's the job of the global hegemon. And if that guarantee disappears, if the system can't be secured anymore, supply chains don't just slow down, they completely shatter.
And the consequence could be a rapid technological regression. I mean, without the ability to source components from all over the world, we'd be forced to rely on whatever stockpiles we have. And the result? As this quote suggests, within a few months, we could be thrown back to 1990s level technology. It would be like a modern technological dark age.
So that's the ultimate question that this crisis is forcing all of us to confront. We really take for granted this complex, incredibly fragile system that delivers everything from our smartphones to our medicine. But if that system breaks, what comes next?
Right now, out in the Iranian desert, roughly 100 miles off the main highway near Isfahan, there's this multi-million-dollar wreckage of several U.S. C-130 transport planes.
Yeah, just quietly sinking into the sand.
Exactly. And Washington is telling us it was, just a simple search and rescue mission gone wrong. The officials have stood at the podiums, they've pointed to the maps, and they've assured everyone that the situation is contained.
Right, but when you look at the sheer mass of the hardware burning in that desert, I mean, the math tells a terrifyingly different story.
It really does. And that is exactly why we are here this morning. It is Tuesday, April 7, 2026. We are exactly 39 days into the war, following the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran.
And it feels like the fog of war is thicker than ever right now.
Oh, absolutely. So I want to speak directly to you listening to this deep dive right now, because whether you're a geopolitical analyst tracking like every single drone movement since late February, or you're just a regular person staring at the gas pump this morning wondering why fuel prices have mutated into something unrecognizable, we're going to connect the dots for you today.
Because in a multi-front conflict like this, it is so easy to get blinded by the daily tactical noise, the strikes, the press conferences, the casualties.
Yeah, the headline stuff.
Exactly. But the real story, the one that will dictate the next decade of human history, is the structural breakdown happening behind the scenes.
The logistics.
Right. It's about supply chains and the terrifying fragility of the global operating system that we all just kind of take for granted.
So here is the mission for this deep dive. We are unpacking three massive interlocking pieces of a puzzle that basically culminates tonight. First, we're going to dissect that bizarre, movie-like military anomaly near Isfahan over the weekend.
Because understanding what really happened in that desert is the key to literally everything else.
Right. Second, we're analyzing the diplomatic standoff triggered by that event as this massive 8:00 p.m. deadline hangs over the globe tonight. And finally, we're going to explore this macroeconomic theory that top analysts are quietly circulating.
The technological dark age scenario.
Yeah, the very real possibility that this specific crisis could accidentally trigger a regression in global technology. Okay, so let's unpack this. I want to start with the dirt strip in Isfahan.
Let's do it.
Because to understand the apocalyptic tension of tonight's 8:00 p.m. deadline, we have to look at what just happened over the weekend. Walk me through the official timeline first. What is the Pentagon claiming actually happened out there?
So the agreed-upon starting point is that a U.S. F-15E Strike Eagle was shot down over Iranian territory.
Okay.
According to the official U.S. narrative, the pilot and a weapons systems officer ejected safely. The U.S. military then launched a recovery operation to extract the crew, and they claim the personnel were successfully rescued.
Right, but then things supposedly go wrong.
Exactly. During this extraction phase, Washington states that two massive C-130 transport planes, along with several helicopters carrying about 100 Special Forces operators, essentially got bogged down.
They got stuck.
Yeah, the official wording mentions getting stuck in the mud or sand at an abandoned agricultural airstrip near the city of Isfahan. And because the aircraft were immobilized and vulnerable to capture, U.S. forces had to intentionally destroy their own assets. They maintained there were 0 U.S. casualties.
Hold on, I'm stuck on the basic logic of this deployment. I'm picturing an F-15 pilot hiding behind a rock somewhere. If my objective is to pick up 1 or 2 guys, why on earth am I landing massive 4-engine C-130 cargo planes?
Right, which are basically flying warehouses.
Exactly. You don't send a convoy of 18-wheelers to pick up a stranded motorist, You sent a nimble helicopter.
And you are identifying the exact logistical discrepancy that has every independent defense analyst raising massive red flags right now.
It just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. A standard combat search and rescue, or CSR, for a downed two-man crew does not look like this. Typically, you deploy a couple of HH-60 Pavehawk helicopters, maybe some A-10 Warthogs, for close air support.
And a small team, right.
Right, a highly trained pararescue team.
Yeah.
You get in, you hoist the guys up, and you get out. You absolutely do not land strategic airlift cargo planes on an unverified dirt strip.
Because they're too heavy.
Exactly. The ground-bearing pressure of a loaded C-130 alone makes landing on an abandoned agricultural strip a massive, totally unnecessary risk. You only do that if you absolutely need the cargo space.
Okay, and the geography doesn't add up either, right? The F-15 was reportedly shot down in the southwestern region, like near the Persian Gulf Coast.
Yep.
But the extraction, this massive botched landing with the C-130s, happened near Isfahan. I looked at the map before we started. That is roughly 110 miles inland across the Zagros Mountains.
It's a massive distance.
Are we really supposed to believe a weapons officer who might be injured from an ejection hiked 110 miles across hostile mountainous terrain in a single day?
It defies physiological possibility. I mean, it's just not possible. Which leads analysts to a much more plausible, albeit deeply classified, alternative scenario.
Which is what?
That the F-15 downing and the Isfahan operation were likely two completely separate events. The F-15 shootdown might have even been a deliberate diversion.
Oh, wow.
Because Isfahan is not just some arbitrary city on the map. It is the epicenter of Iran's nuclear program.
Right.
Specifically, it's the site of deeply buried fortified tunnels that hold Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride.
Uranium hexafluoride. Okay, stop right there and explain the chemistry and physics of this for a second. Why is that specific material so critical?
Well, uranium hexafluoride, or UF6, is the chemical compound used in the actual uranium enrichment process. At room temperature, it's a solid,
Okay.
but it's highly toxic, it's corrosive, and reacts violently with moisture. And when you're enriching uranium to 60%, which, by the way, is a hair's breadth away from the 90% needed for weapons-grade material, you don't just carry it out in a backpack.
How is it stored?
It's stored in massive, heavily shielded, specialized steel cylinders. These things weigh tons. So if you were executing a covert parallel mission to physically seize and extract that stockpile.
Essentially a nuclear heist.
Exactly, a heist.
Yeah.
You suddenly need massive heavy lift capacity.
So you need the C-130s to carry the giant steel cylinders.
Yes.
And you need the 100 Delta Force or Special Forces operators to secure the perimeter of a hardened nuclear facility against the Iranian Revolutionary Guard while you load them. Suddenly, the asset deployment makes terrifying sense.
It perfectly matches the scale of a strategic nuclear seizure, not a pilot rescue. And we have to look at the sheer volume of the hardware losses being reported. We're not just talking about two C-130s here.
What are the real numbers looking like?
Regional intelligence and visual evidence suggest the loss of up to 12 aircraft in total.
Wait, 12 aircraft?
Yeah. We're looking at Black Hawk helicopters, MH-6 Little Bird choppers, which are heavily utilized by Special Operations Command, and MQ-9 Reaper drones that were likely providing overwatch.
That is an absolute catastrophe, 12 aircraft. And the visual evidence from the ground completely contradicts the idea that these planes just got stuck in the mud and were quietly burned by our own guys.
Completely. Look, when a military scuttles an aircraft to prevent capture, it is methodical. You use thermite grenades on the avionics, the crypto gear, the engine blocks. It just melts the sensitive components.
It's a controlled burn.
Exactly. But the satellite imagery and the smartphone footage leaking out of Isfahan show something else entirely. The wreckage has massive structural tearing, wide debris fields, explosive cratering.
Which means what?
That is consistent with incoming heavy artillery, anti-aircraft fire, or a catastrophic mid-air kinetic intercept. It is not a static, controlled burn.
And the Iranian media is just having an absolute field day with this. I saw they're broadcasting footage of recovered military IDs from the wreckage.
Yeah, they are.
And perhaps the most explosive claim is that they found an Israeli passport or visa among the charred remains of the transport planes.
Right. And if that claim is validated, it implies a joint U.S.-Israeli kinetic operation deep inside Iranian sovereign territory, which entirely changes the diplomatic calculus.
Now, we need to maintain strict impartiality here for a second. We are not saying the Iranian narrative is the absolute truth.
No, absolutely not.
Nor are we taking the Pentagon's search and rescue claim at face value. The objective reality, the thing we are actually analyzing is the undeniable massive loss of high-end Western military hardware in a highly sensitive location.
Exactly. The U.S. military suffered a severe logistical and tactical blow this weekend, regardless of what the actual mission was.
And that physical blow in the desert is directly fueling the diplomatic firestorm we are witnessing today, because the Jenga tower is really starting to sway. The loss of those aircraft, combined with the unceasing barrage of Iranian ballistic missiles across the region, has forced Washington into a corner. Which brings us to tonight's 8:00 p.m. deadline.
The rhetoric has escalated from just strategic posturing to, frankly, apocalyptic ultimata. Former President Trump, who obviously retains massive influence over the current policy apparatus, has declared what he calls Power Plant Day and Bridge Day.
Which means what, exactly?
The threat is explicit. If Iran does not immediately cease fire and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to Western shipping, the United States will systematically dismantle Iran's civilian infrastructure.
Wow. But behind closed doors, there was a desperate attempt to hit the brakes, wasn't there?
There was. Through back channels in Pakistan and Egypt, the U.S. actually offered Iran a 45-day temporary ceasefire. Just a pause.
And Iran didn't just reject it, they slammed the door.
They absolutely slammed it. They countered with a 10-point maximalist demand. They demanded a permanent end to the war on all fronts, including Gaza and Lebanon,
Right.
the total withdrawal of all U.S. military bases from the Persian Gulf, full war reparations, and international recognition of their right to tax the Strait of Hormuz.
Which sounds crazy. To the casual observer, Iran rejecting a ceasefire when facing the threat of total infrastructure annihilation seems almost suicidal.
It does, until you look at the spreadsheets. To understand Tehran's calculus, you have to realize that the United States is currently facing the most severe crisis in precision munition stockpiles since the end of the Cold War.
Break that down for me. What are the numbers?
In the first 30 days of this conflict alone, the U.S. Navy and Air Force fired approximately 850 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles.
I want to pause on that number, 850 Tomahawks. Walk me through the manufacturing reality of that weapon, because I think people assume we just have a giant factory in Ohio that stamps these things out like cars on an assembly line.
It's the exact opposite. A Tomahawk missile is essentially a highly complex, autonomous jet aircraft that flies on a one-way mission.
It's not just a dumb rocket.
No, not at all. It requires a Williams turbofan engine, incredibly precise gyroscopes, solid-state radar altimeters, specialized solid rocket boosters.
And the supply chain for all that?
It is extremely narrow and brittle. Firing 850 of them in a month is the equivalent of burning through 5 years of pre-war peacetime production.
5 years?
Yes. You cannot simply flip a switch and 3D print a replacement cruise missile.
And it's not just the offensive missiles, it's the defensive shield that's cracking too, right? The Patriot interceptors.
Precisely. The PASI-3 MSE interceptors, which are the absolute backbone of the defensive shield protecting U.S. bases and allied infrastructure in the Middle East, are practically depleted.
Completely gone.
Practically, yes. Look at the math. A single Iranian Shahed drone might cost $20,000 to produce. A PASI-3 interceptor costs roughly $4 million.
That is an insane cost exchange.
It's totally unsustainable. When Iran fires a swarm of cheap drones and ballistic missiles, the U.S. is forced into this terrible ratio. We have reached a point where the Pentagon is reportedly quietly pulling reserve interceptors from critical allied bases in Japan and South Korea just to keep the Middle Eastern shield functioning.
Wait, really? We are pulling defenses from Asia?
Yes, just to keep the lights on in the Gulf.
So let me play this back to you, because this changes everything about that ceasefire offer. The U.S. offering a 45-day pause wasn't an olive branch.
No.
It wasn't a genuine pivot toward peace. It was a desperate tactical timeout. Washington just needed 45 days to physically ship more interceptors across the ocean and try to spin up production lines.
Exactly. And Iranian military intelligence knows exactly how to read a spreadsheet. They know the U.S. is running dry.
So from Tehran's perspective, agreeing to a 45-day pause is strategically foolish.
Why would you give your vastly superior adversary a 6-week window to reload and fortify their positions, only to resume bombing you later? Iran is executing a classic war of attrition. They are testing the physical limits of the Western military-industrial base.
And they've calculated that time is on their side.
They have.
Which means the 8:00 p.m. deadline tonight is a genuine knife's edge. If Iran refuses to let the U.S. reload, Washington feels it has no choice but to execute Power Plant Day. They're going to start dropping the grid.
But if the U.S. crosses that line, we trigger a concept of mutually assured destruction that has nothing to do with nuclear weapons.
Right. It is mutually assured infrastructure destruction.
Exactly. Iran's doctrine of asymmetric retaliation is incredibly clear, and they have telegraphed it for years. If the U.S. systematically attacks the Iranian civilian power grid, Iran will immediately retaliate against the energy and water infrastructure of the Gulf Cooperation Council.
So the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain,
And Israel.
Hold on, I want to challenge the logic of deterrence here for a second. If Iran systematically dismantles the infrastructure of Dubai or Riyadh, wouldn't that instantly invite an overwhelming existential retaliation from the U.S. military, like turning Tehran into a parking lot?
You would think so.
Right, so why would the Iranian leadership risk absolute annihilation just to hurt some forward operating bases in the Gulf?
Because we are applying a Western framework of risk to a nation that has survived under maximum pressure for decades. Iran is a geographically massive, mountainous country. Its population is highly dispersed, and its critical military infrastructure is buried deep underground. If the U.S. destroys the Iranian power grid, it will be a severe hardship, obviously.
Though they'll survive.
Right. The Iranian state and society will survive. They will adapt to a lower baseline of functioning. The Gulf states, however, do not possess that geographic resilience. Analysts call them fragile theme parks.
Fragile theme parks. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
It means they are hyper-modern, centralized societies constructed in one of the most inhospitable climates on the entire planet. They have practically zero natural freshwater resources.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the water.
A city like Dubai or Abu Dhabi relies almost 100% on massive desalination plants. These are incredibly complex, highly centralized industrial facilities on the coast of the Persian Gulf.
And they turn seawater into drinking water.
Yes, using reverse osmosis or multi-stage flash distillation.
And reverse osmosis requires an astronomical amount of electricity, right, to force seawater through those micromembranes.
Exactly. The power grids and the water grids in the Gulf are intrinsically linked. You cannot separate them. Furthermore, the intake pipes for these desalination plants draw directly from the shallow, easily targeted waters of the Persian Gulf.
So they are sitting ducks.
Pretty much. If a swarm of Iranian drones or anti-ship missiles targets those power plants or the intake valves, the clock doesn't just start ticking, it accelerates rapidly.
Let's follow that scenario to its logical conclusion, because tonight is the deadline. So the missiles hit, the power goes out, the desalination plants stop pumping. What happens to a city of 3 million people in the middle of the Arabian desert when the taps run dry?
Systemic collapse within 48 to 72 hours.
72 hours, that's it.
It's it. You cannot truck in enough bottled water to sustain millions of people when summer temperatures routinely exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The plumbing fails, sanitation collapses, and panic sets in immediately.
It is terrifying.
We are looking at a scenario where millions of citizens, foreign expatriates, and migrant workers are forced to instantly evacuate. They would have to push across the desert, likely heading toward the Mediterranean and Europe.
Triggering a sudden refugee crisis that would probably make the Syrian civil war exodus look minor by comparison.
Completely dwarf it. It's a humanitarian catastrophe on a biblical scale, literally overnight.
And what does that mean for the U.S. military posture? We have, 17 military installations scattered across those Gulf nations?
If the host nation's infrastructure collapses, those bases become completely unviable. Central command logistics relying on local water, local power, and local contractors.
They don't just exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. If the society around the base vanishes, the base cannot operate. Many of these installations are already taking daily damage from low-cost drone harassment. Without local life support, they are just isolated targets starving in the desert.
The historical irony here is just stunning. We always assumed that if the United States left the Middle East, it would be this grand political treaty, or perhaps a massive, pitched naval battle where an aircraft carrier gets sunk.
Right, a conventional defeat.
But instead, the U.S. might be forced to completely abandon the Persian Gulf, simply because the physical environment has been rendered incapable of sustaining human life. The environment itself becomes the weapon that evicts the hegemon.
And while the physical destruction of the Gulf is a looming threat contingent on tonight's 8:00 p.m. deadline, the economic eviction of the United States is already actively happening right now in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, let's pivot to the oil markets, because this is where the average listener is really feeling the pain this morning. I want to clear up a major misconception. If you turn on the cable news, the ticker at the bottom says Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
But if you actually track the maritime data, that's technically false, isn't it?
It is entirely inaccurate. Iran has not blockaded the strait in a blanket fashion. What they have done is implement a highly sophisticated geopolitical toll booth.
Okay, explain that.
They have closed the strait exclusively to the United States, to Israel, to European allies, and to any vessel carrying cargo destined for those nations. But if you are a neutral or non-aligned nation, specifically China, India, or various African states, the strait is completely open to you.
But there are massive structural conditions attached to that transit, right? It's not just a free pass for China.
Absolutely not. The conditions are specifically designed to actively dismantle Western financial dominance.
How so?
First, if a Chinese supertanker wants to pass through to pick up Iranian or Iraqi crude, they must pay a transit tax to Tehran. Second, and crucially, they are strictly forbidden from using Western maritime insurance syndicates, like Lloyd's of London.
Wow.
They must use alternative state-backed insurance. And third, the actual transaction for the oil cannot touch the U.S. dollar.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that. Because since the 1970s, the petrodollar system has dictated that if you want to buy oil anywhere on Earth, you need U.S. dollars. How are China and India buying billions of dollars of oil without using the Western banking system?
They are utilizing the shadow banking system and alternative clearinghouses like China's CIPS.
CIPS.
The cross-border interbank payment system. It bypasses the Western SWIFT network entirely. Think of the traditional global banking system like a massive exclusive casino where the U.S. dollar is the house currency.
Okay, I like that analogy.
For decades, if you wanted to play at any table, meaning buy oil, copper, or wheat, you had to first exchange your national currency for the casino's chips, U.S. dollars. This gave the casino owner of the United States incredible visibility and control over every transaction on the floor.
Yeah, and if they didn't like what you were doing, they just froze your chips.
Precisely. That's what sanctions are. But what China and Iran have done is essentially set up a private VIP backroom in that casino.
They're using their own chips.
Exactly. They are trading oil directly using Chinese yuan or Indian rupees, settling the balances through bilateral currency swap lines. The U.S. banking system has absolutely zero visibility into these transactions.
And more importantly, the U.S. cannot stop them.
They can't.
So imagine finding out that the main highway you use to get your goods to market has been bought by your rival. They haven't destroyed the highway, they are just charging a toll, and they are explicitly refusing to accept your money. They demand a currency you don't control.
That is exactly what is happening to the global energy supply.
And the mathematical result of this bifurcation is a massive price spike. I checked the markets before we recorded. Brent crude oil, the global benchmark, is currently trading at roughly $110 a barrel this morning.
Which is a 70% increase in just half a year.
Right. And the futures markets are pricing in the risk of tonight's deadline. If power plant day happens and the Gulf goes up in flames, conservative estimates project oil spiking to $150 a barrel. Some analysts are modeling worst-case scenarios of $250 a barrel.
It's devastating.
Now, I know exactly what someone listening in, say, Texas or North Dakota is yelling at their steering wheel right now. They are saying, wait a minute, the U.S. is a net energy exporter. We frack our own oil. We have the Permian Basin. Why should my gas prices double just because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked to us?
Right, the energy independence argument.
Exactly. Explain the economic arbitrage here. Why does it still hit us?
It is because oil is a globally fungible commodity. It's all pooled into a single interconnected global market. Yes, the U.S. pulls millions of barrels out of the ground domestically. But the corporations extracting that oil are not charities.
They sell to the highest bidder.
Exactly. They are profit-driven entities. If China's primary supply of cheap Middle Eastern crude is suddenly threatened, or if the maritime insurance premiums out of the Gulf skyrocket, Chinese buyers aren't just going to stop buying oil.
They'll look elsewhere.
They will enter the global market, including the American domestic market, and they will outbid U.S. refineries for that Texas crude.
So the molecule of oil just goes to whoever pays the most.
Yes. You cannot build a wall around the American gas pump. If a supply shock removes 20% of the world's accessible oil, the price for the remaining 80% goes up universally, instantly.
So inflation is exported directly to the American consumer, regardless of our domestic production levels.
Exactly.
Which accelerates this doom loop. The U.S. consumer gets crushed by inflation while the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, accelerate their de-dollarization.
They are actively building a parallel economic universe.
And this is the perfect transition to that macroeconomic theory we promised to discuss. Because analysts are looking at this precise dynamic, the loss of the Middle East, the bypassing of the dollar, the fracturing of shipping lanes, and they are warning about a technological dark age.
Right. Now, when people hear dark age, they imagine a reversion to agrarian subsistence, plows and candle.
Mad Max style.
Exactly. But what macroeconomists are actually warning about is the sudden catastrophic unspooling of the hyper-globalized supply chain that produces advanced technology.
Let's break down how a modern piece of technology is actually made, because I think we just take it for granted. Let's take the smartphone in everyone's pocket, or the servers running the AI algorithms that everyone is obsessed with right now.
The foundational component of the modern world is the advanced semiconductor microchip. To manufacture just one of these chips, you require a supply chain that touches every single continent.
Okay, walk me through it.
You need raw, highly conductive copper mined in Chile or the Democratic Republic of Congo. You need the silicon wafers manufactured in Japan. But the real bottleneck is the lithography.
The machines that actually draw the microscopic circuits onto the silicon?
Yes. Extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography. There's exactly one company on the planet capable of building the most advanced versions of these machines.
Just one?
Just one.
Yeah.
ASML, located in a small town in the Netherlands.
Wait, well, only one? Why can't Apple or the U.S. government just build their own factory in Ohio and make these machines?
Because the physics involved require a level of precision that borders on the impossible.
Like what?
Inside an ASML machine, a microscopic droplet of molten tin is shot through a vacuum chamber. A high-powered laser strikes that droplet precisely 50,000 times a second to generate extreme ultraviolet light.
50,000 times a second. That is insane.
It is. And that light is then bounced off a series of mirrors to focus it onto the silicon wafer. Those mirrors, manufactured by Carl Zeiss in Germany, are the flattest surfaces ever created by humanity.
How flat is that?
If you scaled one of those mirrors up to the size of the entire Earth, the tallest mountain of imperfection on its surface would be less than a millimeter high.
Oh, wow. That is absolutely mind-bending.
It's a miracle of sustained human cooperation. And once you have the machine, you have to safely ship it to a foundry in Taiwan, the TSMC fabs, where the actual chips are printed in clean rooms that are thousands of times purer than a surgical operating theater.
And powering those immense foundries in Taiwan requires massive, uninterrupted streams of baseline energy.
Primarily liquefied natural gas sourced from places like Qatar in the Middle East.
So we have this beautifully complex, globally distributed operating system. And what you are saying is that this entire system runs on exactly two lines of foundational code: the United States Navy and the U.S. petrodollar.
Exactly. The U.S. Navy is the ultimate guarantor of freedom of navigation.
Right.
They police the oceans, deter piracy, and keep the maritime choke points open.
Which keeps global shipping insurance premiums incredibly low.
Right. It allows an ASML machine to safely cross the ocean without costing $1 billion to insure. Simultaneously, the petrodollar provides a unified, frictionless, highly liquid financial protocol.
So a buyer in Taiwan can purchase German optics, Chilean copper, and Qatari gas, all using a single trusted currency.
There's zero friction.
So what happens when we pull those two lines of code out of the system? If the U.S. is forced out of the Middle East tonight, the Navy can no longer guarantee the safety of the shipping lanes.
Maritime insurance premiums don't just go up, they become prohibitively exponential.
And if the global south starts trading in yuan, rupees, and rubles, the frictionless financial system shatters into competing regional walled gardens.
The friction becomes insurmountable. The cost of financing, insuring, and physically moving these hyper-specialized components across hostile, fractured geopolitical lines becomes so high that the assembly line simply stops.
It just grinds to a halt.
Yes, you cannot manufacture an iPhone or a 3-nanometer AI chip entirely within the borders of a single nation state. Not the US, not China, not Europe. The expertise and raw materials are just too geographically dispersed.
So a technological dark age doesn't mean we forget how electricity works. It means we undergo a forced regression in manufacturing capability. We essentially lose the ability to build the future.
Analysts suggest we would regress to the technological baseline of the late 1990s or early 2000s. We could still manufacture basic legacy microchips, the kind that run your washing machine or a basic car engine.
But the frontier technologies.
Advanced medical imaging, generative AI supercomputers, cutting-edge aerospace engineering, Those require a level of unified global cooperation that is currently being vaporized in the skies over the Middle East.
It's like we built this amazing Formula One engine, and it runs beautifully, but it requires a very specific synthetic oil that is only produced in one place. And we just set that factory on fire.
That's a perfect analogy.
And speaking of setting things on fire, while the U.S. is desperately trying to manage this systemic collapse in the Gulf, its own allies in other theaters are making tactical decisions that are inadvertently pouring gasoline on the macroeconomy.
Yes, the unintended consequences are everywhere.
Let's shift our focus to the Black Sea for a minute.
We really have to look at the war in Ukraine, which is still raging parallel to the Middle Eastern crisis. In recent days, the Ukrainian military has significantly escalated its asymmetric capabilities.
What did they do?
They launched a massive swarm of long-range, explosive drones. Reports indicate upwards of 200 drones in a single coordinated operation. Their target was deep inside Russian territory, specifically the major oil export infrastructure at the port of Novorossiysk on the Black Sea.
And the tactical reports say they were successful, right? They sank mercantile shipping and severely degraded the loading terminals. Now, purely on paper, if I am a Ukrainian general fighting a war of survival, this makes total sense.
Tactically, yes.
Russia relies on oil revenues to fund its military-industrial complex. I want to destroy their ability to export oil. So why are global economists and Western policymakers absolutely panicking about this stick today?
Because of the macro timing. You have to view this through the lens of a globally starved energy market.
Okay.
We just established that the Strait of Hormuz toll booth is choking off Middle Eastern supply to the West, driving Brent crude to $110. At this exact moment of maximum vulnerability, Ukraine successfully attacks and removes a massive chunk of Russian oil from the global pool.
They are tightening an already suffocating supply bottleneck.
Right.
But wait, Europe and the U.S. placed heavy sanctions on Russian oil at the start of that war. The West isn't supposed to be buying Russian crude anyway, so why does destroying a Russian port actually hurt the West?
Because of the washing mechanism in the global refining market. Yes, European nations formally banned the direct import of Russian crude oil, but the global economy found a highly profitable workaround.
Which is?
Nations like India stepped in and bought millions of barrels of heavily discounted Russian crude from ports exactly like Novorossiysk. They shipped that crude to massive refinery complexes, like the Jamnagar refinery in Gujarat.
And they refine it.
Right. The Russian crude is boiled down and refined into diesel fuel and jet fuel.
And then India turns around and sells that refined diesel back to Europe at a premium.
Exactly. Once the crude is refined, the molecule of oil no longer carries a Russian passport. It is legally classified as an Indian refined product.
That's quite the loophole.
It is. And the European industrial base, particularly the German manufacturing sector, is utterly reliant on this Indian diesel to keep its factories running and supply chains moving.
So by launching 200 drones at the Russian port, Ukraine is functionally cutting off the raw material that eventually powers European industry.
Yes. They are inadvertently sanctioning their own primary benefactors.
It is a massive strategic miscalculation from a macro perspective.
If Novorossiysk goes offline, the global supply of crude drops further, India's refineries slow down, and the price of diesel in Europe skyrockets. When energy costs double in Europe, their industrial base hollows out. They enter a severe recession.
And a Europe in deep recession does not have the political will or the capital to continue funding Ukraine's war effort.
Exactly. By seeking a short-term tactical victory, Ukraine is basically accelerating the economic exhaustion of the West.
And who benefits from this entire chaotic picture? Who is sitting back and watching the hegemon overextend itself?
Moscow and Beijing. They are executing a masterclass in grand strategy by doing very little kinetically.
Just letting it happen.
Russia benefits immensely from every single dollar that the price of crude goes up. At $110 or $150 a barrel, their treasury is overflowing, regardless of any volume disruptions at their ports.
Meanwhile, China is quietly securing its long-term energy needs from Iran at a massive discount.
And paying in yuan, completely insulated from the Western financial panic.
They aren't trying to fight the U.S. military head-on. They're letting the U.S. bleed itself dry, trying to police a fracturing world.
Neither Russia nor China necessarily desires a sudden overnight collapse of the United States. A sudden collapse would crash the global economy and hurt their own export-driven markets.
Right, they still need us to buy their stuff.
For now, yes. But they are entirely comfortable watching the United States exhaust its missile stockpiles, fracture its alliances, and hollow out its middle class through hyperinflation. They are patiently positioning themselves to dictate the terms of the multipolar world that emerges from the ashes of the unipolar era.
Okay, let's take a breath, because we have covered a staggering amount of ground in this deep dive today.
We really have.
We started with the physical wreckage in the Iranian desert, a supposed rescue mission that required C-130s and resulted in 12 lost aircraft. A massive bloody nose for the U.S. military that points toward a shadow war over deeply buried nuclear material.
And we tracked how that tactical failure fed directly into a desperate diplomatic reality. A depleted American missile defense shield forcing a rejected 45-day ceasefire, leading us right to the brink of mutually assured infrastructure destruction in the Persian Gulf tonight.
Yeah, we analyzed the terrifying fragility of the desalination plants that literally keep that entire region alive.
We looked at the economic warfare already underway, the toll booth in the Strait of Hormuz, the shadow banking system bypassing the SWIFT network entirely.
And the arbitrage that guarantees your gas prices are going to surge regardless of what we pump out of the ground in Texas.
Then we zoomed out to the macroeconomic precipice, the real threat of a technological dark age. The realization that our ability to build the future, from ASML lithography machines to AI data centers, relies entirely on a frictionless global system underwritten by the U.S. Navy and the petrodollar.
A system that is visibly fracturing as we speak. And we saw how uncoordinated moves by desperate allies, like Ukraine's drone strikes on Russian oil ports, are accidentally tightening the noose around the Western economy at the absolute worst possible moment.
It's all connected.
And the terrifying reality is that all of this entire global Jenga tower of logistics, energy, and currency, hangs on the knife's edge of tonight's 8:00 p.m. deadline.
The precision and control that we expect from modern statecraft have just vanished. We are operating entirely in the dark right now, where the consequences of the next missile launch are fundamentally unpredictable.
The decisions made in the coming hours by leaders in Washington and Tehran will likely dictate the trajectory of the global economy for a generation.
I agree completely.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as we approach that deadline tonight. I want you to think about the device you are using to listen to this deep dive right now. Just feel the weight of it in your hand. That phone, or that laptop, is a miracle of hyperglobalization.
It really is.
It is a physical manifestation of a unified world, held together by an invisible, delicate web of secure shipping lanes, universally trusted dollars, and unquestioned military deterrence. If that web breaks tonight, if the shipping lanes close and the financial systems bifurcate, that device might not just become expensive to replace in a few years. It might become mathematically and physically impossible to replace. Are we prepared as a society to live in a world where progress is no longer an inevitable guarantee, but a luxury from a bygone era that we can no longer afford to build?